change it up a little bit and use some special effects, which actually it's just my notes up on the screen is kind of way to put it instead of me shuffling through all this paper. But the book of Jonah, the reason I chose that is because I wanted to cover a topic that applies to us today in our world. And a lot of people might on face value and think, well, what's that got to do with today in our world? But trust me, you'll see. Another reason that I wanted to touch on Jonah is it's one of those books that a lot of people gloss over and somewhat ignore because they don't want to deal with the whole, oh, do you really believe the guy got thrown off the boat and eaten by a fish and stayed alive and all that kind of stuff? There's a lot of skeptics like to throw stones at this book, so it's another reason I wanted to cover it. But so my animation isn't working; those pages are supposed to be turning themselves there. But and special thanks to Tracy for being willing to sit up there and put up with my high maintenance request to do this. But anyway, if we could go to the next slide, please. As always, I'd like to start off with some context. And slide myself over a little bit. Start off with a little context before we just start reading. So first off, who was Jonah? Jonah, well, Jonah, really, because there's no J's in Hebrew. The son of Amittai, was a prophet from Gath. The Bible doesn't directly mention which tribe he was from, but based on Joshua 19:13, that land was given to the tribe of Zebulun, so we can kind of assume that he was probably from that tribe. He is in the Bible more than just the book of Jonah, obviously. He was in 2 Kings 14:25, which was where he prophesied to Jeroboam II about Israel increasing its borders. So it was kind of a political prophecy, and that'll play in here in a minute. And also, he was mentioned 4 times by Jesus himself throughout the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. He was one of the most discussed prophets in all of Jesus' teaching. So, whenever somebody goes down that, well, this was just, it's an analogy, it's just a story to get a point across, and they don't, especially if they're a Christian, and they don't want to believe this was real events. Jesus said it was real events. He said it multiple times. He talked about it as if it was a historical fact, not as if it was just a parable with which to pull a lesson out of. So keep that in mind. And besides, if you can get past Genesis 1:1, that God created the universe through His Word, what's God controlling a fish and using it for His own business? How is that more of a stretch? Go ahead, next slide, please. So the setting in the context of the book of Jonah, it was around the middle of the 8th century BC. It was, like I said, during the reign of Jeroboam II. And at the time, the northern kingdom was prosperous, but on a moral decline. And you can see that on a lot of the world today. Sometimes when a nation's prosperous, it starts to wander off its path. And of course, the city Nineveh, which the place he was ordered to go, was in the kingdom of Assyria. And Assyria they were kind of in a quiet spell. They had been conquering basically all of Mesopotamia in horrific ways. And Israel was basically next. You know, they had already went through Damascus and Tyre, and they made them vassal states, and they had to, which was just about bankrupting them as they were having to pay off the Assyrians to keep from being slaughtered. And they used terrorism to the extreme. They make modern day terrorists look quite tame. They were very, very vicious people. Next slide, please. And just to give you an idea roughly what the geography was here. So you see Nineveh up there in the kind of the darker brown area. That was the Assyrian Empire during the time of this writing. The lighter brown or orangish color is what they eventually expanded into. So seeing Assyria at the time as the looming menace that's going to consume Israel was a very valid fear, and it would have been something that was on everyone's mind in Israel. Next. What was Assyria, and in particular Nineveh? And Nineveh was the capital of Assyria, by the way. What were they known for? Now these are quotes that are not, they're extra biblical, they're not in the Bible. You can go to the British Museum in London, which I was blessed with an opportunity to visit 2 years ago. And the Mesopotamian section of the British Museum was like one of my favorite sections, because they had all of these, because Nineveh is still a place, it still exists. It's right next to Mosul, Iraq. There's reliefs, stone reliefs and cylinders with cuneiform and tablets, and there's all kinds of stuff detailing their conquests and detailing exactly what they did. And these are quotes from some of the kings as written on those tablets. I flayed as many nobles as had rebelled against me and draped their skins over the wall of the city. And if you're not familiar with the term flaying, it's being skinned alive completely. And they wallpapered their city walls with it. And that was Ashurnasirpal II the second. Then I impaled them on stakes in front of their cities. And that was Shalmaneser III. I cut off their hands and feet, their noses and ears, and many I put out the eyes of, Sennacherib. Their heads I cut off, their corpses I bound to stakes around the city. I always have a problem with that one. Anybody know how to pronounce that one right? But anyway, that guy. And this is the stuff they bragged about. And it's the stuff that other people told stories about. There's biblical accounts of their ferocity and their barbarity. They were known to, when they did conquer a people, they would disperse you. They would take the lucky ones that didn't have these things happen to them. They got dispersed throughout other regions and intermingled with other cultures to basically get rid of their ethnicity, get rid of their culture, get rid of their national identity. They would cut people's hands off, cut their noses and ears off, poke all but one eye out, put a big fish hook through the bottom of their jaw and have it be coming out the top, and lead them through the city in that butchered state to be just humiliated, until they died. They were very, very, very brutal. And it's not a city you would have looked forward to visiting as someone that they saw as a future conquest. Next slide, please. This is one of those stone reliefs that's on display in the British Museum. You see these soldiers on the end there are peeling the skin off of those guys with their hands tied in front of them. This was their culture. It was all consumed by that type of behavior, and that's one of the reasons they were so successful in conquering the rest of Mesopotamia. People didn't want to fight them because they didn't want to end up dealing with those repercussions. So I think this stuff is important to know going into the book of Jonah, because when you look at the book on its face value, it doesn't describe all of those things, because when it was written, people understood those things and it didn't have to be described to them, right? So in our world today, from a very simplistic view, if we say, well, God told him to go to Nineveh, why did he not follow God's orders? This was not an appealing thing. This was not an appealing place to go. And there's other reasons too, but we'll get to those. Next slide, please. Okay, we'll read chapter 1, and then we'll kind of break it down. And this is a real short. We can go through the whole book of Jonah tonight. It's basically 3 pages. So if everybody wants to find Jonah in their Bible, I'll give you a minute to do that if you want to read along. This Bible is the NASB version, but they're all pretty close. I went through several going through this. Okay, Jonah chapter 1. The word of the Lord came to Jonah, the son of Amittai, saying, "Arise, go to Nineveh, the great city, and cry out against it, because their wickedness has come before me." But Jonah got up to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. So he went down to Joppa, found a ship that was going to Tarshish, paid the fare, and boarded it to go with them to Tarshish, away from the presence of the Lord. However, the Lord hurled a great wind on the sea, and there was a great storm on the sea, so that the ship was about to break up. Then the sailors became afraid, and every man cried out to his God. And they hurled the cargo which was in the ship into the sea to lighten it for them. But Jonah had gone below into the stern of the ship and had lain down and fallen sound asleep. So the captain approached him and said, "How is it that you are sleeping? Get up and call on your God. Perhaps your God will be concerned about us so that we will not perish." And each man said to his mate, "Come, let's cast lots so that we may find out on whose account this catastrophe has struck us." So they cast lots, and the lot fell on Jonah. Then they said to him, "Tell us now, on whose account has this catastrophe struck us? What is your occupation? Where do you come from? What is your country? And from what people are you?" So he said to them, "I am a Hebrew, and I fear the Lord God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land." Then the men became extremely afraid, and they said to him, "How could you do this?" For the men knew that he was fleeing from the presence of the Lord, because he had told them. So they said to him, "What should we do with you that the sea will become calm for us?" For the sea was becoming increasingly stormy. And he said to them, "Pick me up and hurl me into the sea. Then the sea will become calm for you, because I know that on the account of me this great storm has come upon you." However, the men rowed desperately to return to land, but they could not, because the sea was becoming even stormier against them. Then they cried out to the Lord and said, "We earnestly pray, O Lord, do not let us perish on account of this man's life, and do not put innocent blood on us. For you, Lord, have done as you pleased." So they picked up Jonah, and they hurled him into the sea, and the sea stopped its raging. Then the men became extremely afraid of the Lord, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows. And the Lord designated a great fish to swallow Jonah, and Jonah was in the stomach of the fish for 3 days and 3 nights. Okay, so there's chapter 1. The first thing we want to kind of pick out as we go back through it is Jonah was fleeing to Tarshish to escape the presence of the Lord. Well, that doesn't make a lot of sense to us. And I don't know how educated Jonah was, or the details of his upbringing, other than that he was from Gath in Galilee. But a common misunderstanding in the ancient world, in the ancient Mesopotamian world in particular, since most of these countries were pagan. Well, everybody was pagan except for Israel, and they had basically gods that they had made up. And it was understood that the God of a nation only had power over that nation in its territory. There wasn't really a God of the universe in their perspective. And like I said, I don't know exactly what was going on in Jonah's mind. You would think he would know better, but oftentimes we tend to default to the common understandings of our culture, even when we know better. So to escape to Tarshish, and Tracy, can you do me a favor? Can you skip ahead to slide 9? I should have put this in there twice. Tarshish, way over there on the southern tip of Spain, right at the Strait of Gibraltar, right? And Joppa is the beginning of that red line way over there, right next to Israel. So he didn't have to go far to get to Joppa, but his intention was to basically go to Spain. That, at the Straits of Gibraltar right there, the edge of Portugal, that was the edge of the world to them. They didn't know of the Americas and Greenland and Iceland and everything to the west. So that was the end of the known world. That was as far as he could physically go. So if he had the understanding that the God of Israel has power over Israel and the people of Israel and the land of Israel, this would be where the flee from God comes from. But we know better. He should have known better. But that was the common understanding at the time. Okay, Tracy, thanks. You can go back to the other one. Should have put those in a different order. So that was the whole point of fleeing to Tarshish. And when the pagan men, it's back to that whole the gods only control people who are from their cultures and stuff. You could tell those guys, that's why they desperately wanted to know where he was from. What's your occupation? Because a lot of occupations had their own patron gods. So all of these little things were just kind of a sign of how these people viewed the world. And when they tried to row back to shore, and these evidently were pretty good guys, because Jonah said, just throw me in, and they didn't want to. They desperately didn't want to. They tried to row the boat to shore to just put him off, but God had other plans and wouldn't allow it. So they ended up giving in and throwing him over and begging God for forgiveness. And then when the seas calmed, and you got to remember too, these were professional career sailors. They would have saw storms before. This must have been a very, very different scenario than they had come across before to think it was a supernatural event. And then when the seas calmed, and it said they became extremely afraid of the Lord and feared the Lord, and they offered sacrifices to the Lord and made vows. So this is the first time in the book of Jonah where pagans had reverence for Yahweh because they saw his true might. And then lastly, the Lord designated a great fish to swallow Jonah. And he was in the stomach of the fish for 3 nights. Now, this is where a lot of people have a hang up and they try to say this was just an analogy and it's not a real story. And people try to, what kind of fish could possibly swallow a man? How could he survive? How could he breathe? How would the stomach juices not digest him? The God of the universe that created the entire world, that created every molecule in the world, is not bound by the rules of the universe that he created. If you build a hamster cage and put a hamster in it, you're not bound by that cage. The hamster is. You can modify that cage and do anything you want to it. If God wanted to repurpose a fish, a great fish, he could have just, if the whole universe could come into existence from his word, what's having a fish do a special job for 3 days? That's kind of nothing. And you think the created men build submarines that'll take 120 guys under the ocean for 3 months. If we can do that, then it's not really that big of a stretch to think God could utilize a fish that he created in that way. And kind of a summary of chapter 1, Jonah chapter 1 reveals a prophet who runs from God's mercy only to discover that God's reach extends across the land and sea. And even through a storm, he is pursuing not just Jonah's obedience, but the salvation of others. Okay, on to chapter 2. So now the scenario is Jonah is in the belly's fish. And chapter 2, I'll read this summary actually before I read this. Chapter 2 is like a psalm. You know, it's a psalm of thanksgiving from the depths, a poetic reflection of a man who has faced death, recognized God's discipline, and experienced undeserved mercy in the belly of a fish. Jonah finally stops running and remembers the God who saves. So let's read his psalm here in chapter 2. Then Jonah prayed to the Lord, his God, from the stomach of the fish, and he said, I called out of my distress to the Lord, and he answered me. I called for help from the depth of Sheol. You heard my voice. You threw me into the deep, in the heart of the seas, and the current flowed around me. All your breakers and waves passed over me. So I said, I have been cast out of your sight. Nevertheless, I will look again toward your holy temple. Water encompassed me to the point of death. The deep flowed around me. Seaweed was wrapped around my head. I descended to the base of the mountains, the earth with its bars around me forever. But you have brought up my life from the pit, Lord my God. While I was fainting away, I remembered the Lord, and my prayer came to you into your holy temple. Those who are followers of worthless idols abandon their faithfulness, but I will sacrifice to you with a voice of thanksgiving. That which I have vowed, I will pay. Salvation is from the Lord. Then the Lord commanded the fish, and it vomited Jonah up onto dry land. So he had a turning point. He was rebellious. He went away. God wouldn't let these guys take him back to shore because The fish was part of God's plan from the beginning. And when Jonah finally kind of repented during his calling out from the depths of Sheol, like he said, God then recommissioned him, freed him from the fish, and had the fish vomit him up onto dry land. I think that's a basking shark in that picture there, but yeah, it could be. But it gets the point across. And like I say, when people get into arguments over, well, this fish couldn't have done whatever, this is the power of God. It doesn't have to meet our understanding. So, in chapter 3, which you can go ahead and skip ahead, please. Okay, chapter 3 is kind of Jonah's second commission. So, let's read that one. Now the word of the Lord came to Jonah the second time, saying, "Arise, go to Nineveh, the great city, and proclaim to it the proclamation which I am going to tell you." So Jonah got up and went to Nineveh, according to the word of the Lord. Now Nineveh was an exceedingly large city, a 3 days' walk. And some different versions talk about the breadth of the city was 3 days, so they kind of expound on that. But this is a direct literal translation. So they're saying the size of it, if you walked from one side or the other, would take 3 days. That wouldn't be inside the city walls. That would be kind of the whole district of Nineveh. Then Jonah began to go through the city 1 day's walk, and he cried out and said, 40 more days, and Nineveh will be overthrown. Then the people of Nineveh believed in God, and they called a fast and put on sackcloth, from the greatest to the least of them. When word reached the king of Nineveh, he got up from his throne, removed his robe from himself, covered himself with sackcloth, and sat on the dust. And he issued a proclamation, and it said, "In Nineveh, by the decree of the king and his nobles, no person, animal, herd, or flock is to taste anything. They are not to eat or drink water, but every person and animal must be covered with sackcloth, and people are to call on God vehemently, and they are to turn each one of him from his evil way and from the violence which is in their hands. Who knows God may turn and relent, and to turn from his burning anger, so that we will not perish." When God saw their deeds, that they had turned from their evil way, then God relented of the disaster which he had declared he would bring on them. So he did not do it. Now this part here, it's like, it may be hard to understand how an entire evil kingdom can instantly flip from this one guy just walking in town saying, you got 40 days. But let's kind of look at the big picture. Jonah was swallowed by a big fish. And in ancient Mesopotamia, with all these different pagan gods, there was 4 gods in particular in Assyria that were represented by fish. And one of them, Enki, he was like the senior god of Assyria, was a fish. Ones was, there's evidence of Onez, another fish god, that's on those tablets and stuff from Nineveh. Apkallu was a fish god that was worshipped in the palaces of the king. And Dagon, which kind of came a little later, was also a god that was represented by a fish. Matter of fact, the Hebrew word or the Semitic word dog, or it's more like dag, D-A-G, is fish. So Dagon, fish god. So Jonah was swallowed by a fish, which seems silly at first until you think the fish came up to land and spit him out. There was probably witnesses to that. If you were an ancient Mesopotamian pagan and you worshipped a fish god, and a fish delivered a man to shore and he said he had a message for you, that'd be kind of a big deal, right? So, and then on his journey, can you go ahead and skip back to that map? Right. So the red line is what he intended to do. The orangish brown line is what He actually did. So you see the boat got out to sea a little bit. You can see the point where they tossed him overboard. He was swallowed by a fish, and this fish swam up toward the coast of Lebanon there, put him out. And then he still had to walk all the way across Syria to get to northern Iraq there to get to Nineveh. So if there were witnesses when he was spit out by the fish god, and then he had to journey all that way, word of that would have traveled and possibly even preceded him. Because how else could a Jew from Israel just walk into the most evil country in the world that intended on conquering them and walk around saying you're going to get destroyed without getting a big fish hook in his mouth and his hands cut off and all the other horrible things that they like to do? Clearly, they let this man speak for a reason. And I think that reason is probably tied into the symbolism that God chose to use in that fish. Okay, so now, chapter 4. So now they're spared. God didn't kill them. But it greatly displeased Jonah, and he became angry. Then he prayed to the Lord and said, "Please, Lord, was this not what I said when I was still in my own country? Therefore, in anticipation of this, I fled to Tarshish, since I knew that you were a gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger and abundant in mercy, and one who relents of disaster. So now, Lord, please take my life from me, for death is better to me than life." But the Lord said, "Do you have a good reason to be angry?" Then Jonah left the city and sat down east of it. There he made a shelter for himself and sat in a shade until he could see what would happen in the city. So the Lord God designated a plant and grew it up over Jonah to be a shade over his head, to relieve him of his discomfort. And Jonah was overjoyed about the plant. But then God designated a worm when dawn came the next day, and it attacked the plant and it withered. And then the sun came up. God designated a scorching east wind, and the sun beat down on Jonah's head so that he became faint, and he begged with all his soul to die, saying, "Death is better to me than life." But God said to Jonah, do you have a good reason to be angry about the plant?" And he said, "I have a good reason to be angry, even to the point of death." Then the Lord said, "You had compassion on the plant, for which you did not work, and which you did not cause to grow, which came up overnight and perished overnight. Should I not have compassion on Nineveh, the great city, where there are more than 120,000 people who do not know the difference between their left hand and their right hand, as well as many animals?" And that's where it ends. But there is a very important message here to break down. Jonah was upset that God saved Nineveh, right? Why? Why would he be upset? Well, they were horrible beasts of a country. But there's also a political component to this. Remember when Jonah was the prophet for Jeroboam II, his prophecy was about the growth of Israel's borders, the expansion of their lands. That's essentially a political aspect. And Assyria was their rivals, vicious rivals, that they were in jeopardy of being conquered by in a horrific way. Jonah didn't want to see the enemy saved. He would rather have saw brimstone rain down on it like Sodom and Gomorrah. That would have probably made him happy. But he was upset that God saved him. And he even said there, that is why he fled to Tarshish, because I knew this was going to happen. I knew you would save them, and I didn't want you to save them. That's essentially his argument. So when God brought up the plant to shade him, and then the plant dies, and he was mournful over the loss of the plant, and it's when God brought up that point. You had pity for this plant, but you don't think I should have pity for those people? And he said 120,000 people who do not know the difference between their right hand and their left hand. Well, that sounds like an odd thing to say. There's two schools of thought from scholars on that. One is that it was 120,000 children, so they were young and didn't kind of know anything, didn't know any better. And so if you take a city that's 3 days walk across, 120,000 children would have probably been 25% of the population. The math works out for that. But another school of thought is that it was a Hebraic, idiom for people who had no spiritual knowledge, were basically spiritually ignorant and didn't understand right from wrong. So if you were brought up in that world, if you were brought up in that society, and that's all you knew, and you had never been offered another path, then perhaps you would have been participating in all that stuff, and God would have understood that and had compassion on those people, even though they had been involved in horrible things, so long as they repented and turned to Him. So what this lesson really teaches us for our modern perspective, look at our world today. Whether it's another political party, whether it's somebody on the other side of a protest line that is rabidly hates your way of life and everything about you and wants to destroy you. Whether it's, and to use an extreme example, Hamas and Israel. All of the people on the other side of the fence that you have a political or social line drawn between you and them are also God's creation. They're also God's children. And Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount said, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. He said, I know you have heard you are to love your neighbor and hate your enemies, but I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. That's a command from Jesus Himself. And then in Luke 15:10 is where it mentions that every time a sinner repents, there is celebration and rejoicing by all the angels in heaven. So for you to not want your enemy or someone who has declared themselves as your enemy to receive salvation, you're essentially saying, I want to steal the joy from heaven. And that's pretty heavy, right? So we need to remember, and I think it's the whole point of the story of Jonah, is we need to remember, not only do we need to be loyal to God, but we need to be loyal to what God's own wants and intentions are, even when they conflict with our own. Everybody standing on the other side of the fence from us who is against us, we should pray for them. We shouldn't be supportive of what they're doing. You know, if a dictator took over the country and was rounding us all up and doing horrible Hitlerian type things, instead of saying somebody needs to take him out, as a Christian, you should be thinking, I hope there's a way he can find Jesus and repents. Because not only would that solve your problem of being tyrannized, is heaven would rejoice when that sinner repented. And you would be much better off hoping to meet them in heaven someday than to hope they burn in hell for all of eternity to satisfy your own desires. So, well, that's about it for our little 3-page book. I hope you got something out of that. There